Hello everyone, I met my wife in college. It wasn't some grand, dramatic love story. We were both young, both trying to figure out our lives, and at first, we were just friends. She was outgoing, social, always the center of attention. I was more reserved, focused on my studies, more interested in building a future than in partying every weekend like most people our age. But somehow, we ended up spending more and more time together, and before I even realized it, we had become something more. We dated all through college, and by the time we graduated, I thought I had found the person I was going to spend the rest of my life with. It felt right. It felt like we were building something solid, something real. She got a job in marketing not long after graduation. It was a good job, steady pay, decent benefits, and it gave her the freedom she loved. She always liked traveling, always wanted to see new places, and her job allowed her to do that. At first, it was just occasional trips, a few days here and there, nothing that ever seemed unusual. I had started my own business after college, something I had been working toward for years, and I threw myself into it completely. I worked long hours, sometimes late into the night, building something from the ground up. She supported me, or at least, she said she did. She always told me she was proud of me, always reassured me that she understood why I was working so hard. And for a long time, I believed her that we got married after a few years of dating. It wasn't a rushed decision. I had taken my time, made sure we were both ready, made sure we wanted the same things. We had a beautiful wedding, a honeymoon that felt like something out of a dream, and then we settled into our lives together. We bought a house, a place that we both fell in love with the moment we saw it. It was everything we had wanted, big enough for the future we had planned, in a quiet neighborhood that felt like home. We both worked hard, both contributed, both built our lives together. Or at least, that's what I thought. For years, everything seemed fine. We had our routine. She worked, I worked, we spent time together when we could. We had our own cars, but she always used the company car for her business trips. It was part of her job, part of the way things had always been. She never had any complaints about it. She never gave me a reason to think anything was wrong. And I never questioned it. I trusted her. I believed in her, but looking back now, I realize how blind I was. Life was moving forward, and for a long time, I thought we had everything we needed. My business had taken off, growing from something small into something that gave us real financial stability. I wasn't some millionaire, but I had worked hard, invested smartly, and now we lived comfortably. We had the house, multiple cars, vacations when we wanted them, and we didn't have to stress about money like we did in the early years. My wife's career was steady as well. She wasn't climbing any corporate ladder, but she had a good position, one she seemed to enjoy. It gave her the travel she loved, the freedom to move, and she always came back from her trips talking about the people she met, the deals she closed, the networking events that had gone well. She was confident, ambitious in her own way, and I admired that about her. Our marriage had its normal ups and downs, but nothing that ever seemed out of place. We had our arguments, our disagreements, but we always made up. I had always been the type to let things go, to avoid unnecessary conflict. She, on the other hand, had a way of talking circles around me, of making sure that whatever the argument was about, she came out on top. But I never thought much of it. I figured that was just how she was, how relationships worked. You compromise. You let things go. You move on. And I did. The changes started small. Too small to notice at first. She started taking longer trips than before, saying they were last-minute meetings, extended conferences, urgent client demands. It was always reasonable, always something that made sense when she explained it. And I never doubted her. Why would I? She had always traveled for work, and if her job was getting more demanding, that was just part of the career she had chosen. I had my own business to run, my own responsibilities, and I wasn't the type to obsess over where she was every second of the day. I trusted her, but then, the company car started getting left behind. She had always used it for work trips. It was part of her job, part of the company's policy, something she had never complained about before. But now, she was suddenly opting to take one of our personal cars. And not just any car, she always took the most expensive one, the one I had bought as a reward for myself after years of hard work. It was my favorite, the one I took care of, the one I rarely drove because I wanted to keep it in pristine condition. She had never shown much interest in it before, but now, it was the only one she wanted to take. When I asked her about it, she had an explanation ready. The company car had issues. Maintenance problems. Some excuse about it not handling long trips well. It was always something, always a reason that made just enough sense for me to brush off my suspicions. I didn't press the issue. I had never been the kind of husband who questioned her every move. If she needed to use one of our cars, so be it. It wasn't worth an argument, but as the months passed, I started to notice more. She was more distant. More distracted when she was home. She spent more time on her phone, smiling at messages she never shared with me, putting it down the moment I walked into the room. When we used to have dinner together, she would talk about her day, ask about mine, be present in the moment. But now, it felt like she was somewhere else entirely. Like she was physically sitting across from me, but mentally, she was miles away. I told myself it was stress. That she was just dealing with work pressures, that the traveling was exhausting, that maybe I was overthinking things. But there were moments when doubt crept in, little moments that made my stomach twist in ways I couldn't ignore, like the time I noticed she had changed her perfume. She had worn the same fragrance for years, something subtle, something familiar. But one day, she came home smelling different. It wasn't bad, just, not her. When I mentioned it, she laughed, said she had just wanted a change, that she had picked it up while traveling. But it stuck with me. She wasn't the type to change things on a whim. She liked routine, liked what was familiar. And yet, here she was, smelling like someone else entirely. Or the time I caught her staring at her reflection in the mirror for longer than usual before a trip. She had always cared about how she looked, but now, there was something else in her expression, something calculating, something almost rehearsed. Like she wasn't just getting ready for a work meeting but for something else. Someone else. That I brushed it all off. I told myself I was being paranoid. That I had no reason to suspect her of anything. But then came the night she got a call and stepped outside to answer it. It was late. Too late for a work call. We had been watching a movie together, something we hadn't done in a while, something I had suggested because I missed spending time with her. But when her phone rang, she didn't even hesitate. She got up, grabbed it, and walked outside without a word. I paused the movie. I waited 0.5 minutes. 10 minutes. 15. When she came back in, she was different. Her whole demeanor had changed. She seemed irritated, distracted, like she had just had a conversation she didn't want me to know about. When I asked who it was, she barely looked at me when she said it was a coworker. Some project she had to wrap up before her next trip. She hadn't even realized I had heard the tail end of her conversation through the window. I can't talk right now. He's here. The moment she said it, something inside me shifted. I didn't say anything that night. I let it go. I pretended I hadn't heard. But that was the moment when everything changed for me. That was the moment I knew something was wrong. That I just didn't know how bad it was going to get. That I couldn't ignore it anymore. That night, after hearing her say, "I can't talk right now. He's here," something inside me snapped into focus. It wasn't just paranoia. It wasn't just me overthinking things. There was something happening, something she was hiding, and I was done pretending not to see it. But I didn't confront her. Not yet. I needed more. I needed to be absolutely sure before I made a move, before I let her know that I was onto her. She acted normal the next morning, kissed me goodbye before heading to work, and I played my part. I acted like I hadn't heard a thing, like I wasn't suspicious, like I wasn't already planning my next steps. I went through my normal routine, but my mind was elsewhere, piecing things together, going over every odd moment, every shift in her behavior. And that's when I remembered the car. She had started taking our most expensive car instead of the company vehicle, and it had never made sense to me. But now, it did. If she was hiding something, if she was going somewhere she wasn't supposed to be, she wouldn't want her company tracking her. The company car had GPS built in. If she was doing anything shady, she wouldn't risk using it. I decided to test my theory. That evening, when she got home, I mentioned in passing that I had taken her company car for a quick drive. I lied, told her I had moved it around the driveway and noticed the engine making a weird noise. I watched her reaction closely. She froze for just a second. Just long enough for me to notice. Then, she forced a laugh, shook her head, said it was probably nothing, that she had noticed it too but hadn't thought much of it. But her expression was too tight. Her voice was too controlled. She was covering something that I let it go. Acted like I believed her, and that night, while she was asleep, I made my move. I went to the garage, opened the trunk of the car she had been using, and placed a GPS tracker inside. A small one, barely noticeable, something I had bought online weeks ago when I first started having doubts. I didn't know if I would ever use it, but now, I was glad I had it. I activated it, set it to send updates to my phone, then walked back inside as if nothing had happened. The next morning, she told me she had another trip coming up. Just a few days, nothing unusual. She barely even looked at me when she said it, like it was just another routine part of her job, like I wasn't even worth the effort of pretending anymore. I kissed her goodbye, told her to be safe, watched as she drove off, and then, I checked my phone. The GPS showed her exact location, updating every few minutes. At first, everything looked normal. She was on the highway, heading in the direction she always did for her business trips. But as I kept tracking her, something stood out. She wasn't going where she said she was. Her company had offices in a different city, one that was hours away from where the GPS showed she was heading. She wasn't going there. She was going somewhere else, the same city. The same location. Over and over again. My heart pounded as I scrolled through the tracker history. Every single one of her business trips for the past few months had ended up in the exact same place. Not once had she gone to the office where she claimed to be working. This wasn't an accident, this wasn't a coincidence. She had been lying to me. I gripped my phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. The pieces were coming together, and the picture they were forming wasn't just painful, it was infuriating. She had been using my car, my money, my trust to go somewhere she wasn't supposed to be, and now, I needed to see it with my own eyes. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the keys to another car, one she wouldn't recognize as easily. If she was doing what I thought she was doing, I couldn't risk her spotting me. I drove, following the GPS tracker, watching as she stopped in that same city once again. It took hours, but eventually, I arrived, and what I saw made my blood run cold. She was there, not at a business meeting. Not at a conference, she was sitting at a restaurant with someone else. A man, they were laughing, talking, leaning in close like they had done this 100 times before. And then, without a second thought, she reached for his hand. My wife, the woman I had trusted for years, the woman I had built a life with, was sitting across from another man, holding his hand, smiling at him like I didn't even exist. I stayed in the car, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my nails dug into my palms. I wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. I needed more. So I pulled out my phone and I started recording. I sat in the car, watching them, my mind racing in a way I had never experienced before. My body felt frozen, my fingers gripping the phone, my breath coming in slow, controlled inhales, but my heart was pounding in my chest like a drum. There she was. The woman I had built my life with. The woman I had trusted. Sitting across from another man, laughing, leaning in, holding his hand as if I didn't exist. As if I had never existed. I wanted to storm inside, flip the table, demand answers. I wanted to see the look on her face when she realized she had been caught. But I didn't move. I forced myself to sit still, to think, to be smarter than my emotions. I had worked too hard to get to this point. This wasn't just about my pride. This was bigger than that. I needed proof. I pressed the record button on my phone. The camera zoomed in, capturing the way her fingers traced lazy circles against the back of his hand. She was saying something that made him laugh, something that made her smile in a way she hadn't smiled at me in years. I recorded for minutes, making sure to get everything, making sure there was no room for doubt. And then I did the only thing I could think of. I got out of the car. I didn't walk toward them. Not yet. I walked toward the restaurant, toward the entrance, slipping inside without drawing attention. I needed a closer look, needed to hear what they were saying. The place was dimly lit, expensive, the kind of place couples go when they want to have an intimate moment without interruptions. And they had picked a table in the back, away from the crowd, just far enough that I had to move carefully to get close. I found a spot near the bar, just within earshot, and I listened. "Are you sure he doesn't suspect anything?" the man asked, his voice low but clear. She laughed, that same soft, teasing laugh I used to love. "He's clueless. He believes everything I tell him." The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. "I just need a little more time," she continued, sipping her wine. "Once I get things sorted, we'll have everything. The money, the house, the cars. It's all in my name anyway. He won't even see it coming." I had to grip the edge of the bar to stop myself from moving. My ears were ringing. The room felt too hot. She wasn't just cheating, she was planning to take everything from me. I closed my eyes, forcing my breathing to stay steady. I wanted to walk up to that table and end it right there. But if she thought I was clueless, if she thought she had the upper hand, then that meant I had the advantage. If she was playing a game, then I was going to make sure I was the one who won. I turned to the bartender, my voice calm despite the storm raging inside me. "Do you see them here often?" He glanced toward the table, then back at me. "Yeah. They come in pretty regularly." He gave me a look, one that told me he knew exactly what was happening. "I need a favor," I said. "I'll be back here this weekend. I need you to say something when I bring my wife with me." The bartender hesitated, but when I slid a bill across the counter, he nodded. "What do you need me to say?" I told him, then I left. I didn't look at her as I walked out. I didn't want to see her face, didn't want to see the way she smiled at him. I had seen enough. I had heard enough. Now, it was my turn. The drive home felt like a blur. My mind was already working through my next steps, through everything I needed to do before she figured out what was coming. I had recordings now. I had proof. But that wasn't enough. I needed to make sure she couldn't twist the story, couldn't turn this around on me like she had always been so good at doing. That I started with the finances. That night, while she was still on her business trip, I went through every document, every account, every asset we had together. She had been smart, had made sure that most things were in her name. But she had underestimated me. I had always trusted her, always let her handle things, but I wasn't blind. I knew where our money was. I knew how to protect myself. And now, I was going to make sure she didn't take a single thing from me. I transferred what I could. Froze accounts where necessary. Set up alerts so that if she tried to move anything, would know immediately. It was tedious, exhausting, but it needed to be done. Because when this was over, I wasn't just going to catch her. I was going to make sure she lost everything she had been planning to take from me. She came home the next day, greeted me like nothing had happened. Kissed me on the cheek, told me she missed me, asked how my week had been. I smiled, played my part, acted like the same clueless husband she thought I was. "Let's go out this weekend," I suggested, my voice casual. "Somewhere nice. A date night. We haven't had one in a while." Her face lit up. "That sounds perfect." I knew she thought she had one. She had no idea what was coming. The days leading up to the weekend felt like the longest of my life, but I played my role perfectly. I acted as if nothing was wrong, as if I was just a loving husband planning a date night for his wife. I went to work, kept my conversations with her normal, smiled when she spoke, laughed at her jokes, and pretended not to notice how she kept glancing at her phone when she thought I wasn't looking. It was almost impressive how well she could lie. How easily she could slip into this routine of deceit, how effortlessly she could stand in front of me and tell me she loved me, knowing full well she had been sitting in a restaurant with another man just days before, planning how she was going to take everything I had worked for. But I had seen the truth now, and I was going to make sure she felt the same kind of betrayal, the same kind of devastation, only worse. The night of our date, she dressed up more than usual. She stood in front of the mirror for longer than necessary, adjusting her hair, fixing her dress, making sure every detail was perfect. Maybe she was trying to remind herself why she had chosen me in the first place. Maybe she was trying to convince herself that she wasn't as terrible as she really was. Maybe she was just putting on another performance. Either way, I let her. I told her she looked beautiful, took her hand as we walked to the car, played my part just like she had played hers for so long. She had no idea I was leading her to her downfall. The drive to the restaurant was quiet, comfortable, exactly how it should have been between two people who had been together for years. She didn't suspect anything. She didn't glance around nervously. She had no idea that she had sat in this very restaurant with him just days ago, no idea that I had been in the background, watching, recording, listening to every word she had said. When we arrived, the hostess greeted us, led us to a table, and we sat down like any normal couple out for a romantic night. I could see it in her eyes she thought she had won, and then the bartender approached. He glanced at me first, then at her. I gave him the smallest nod, barely noticeable, but enough for him to know it was time. He smiled, wiped his hands on his apron, and leaned slightly toward the table. "Good evening, welcome back," he said, his voice casual, friendly, as if he had no idea what he was about to do. "Can I get you the same one you had last time with that man?" Her smile faltered instantly. Her body stiffened. It was such a small moment, barely a second of hesitation, but I saw it. I saw the way her fingers curled slightly, the way her throat moved as she swallowed, the way her eyes darted toward me before forcing herself to look back at the bartender. She was caught. And she knew it. She forced a small laugh, too strained, too fake, shaking her head as if he had made a mistake. "I think you have me confused with someone else," she said, her voice light, dismissive, trying to regain control. "I've never been here with anyone else." The bartender tilted his head, as if considering, then shrugged. "Oh, my mistake," he said, giving me a knowing glance before walking away, and then I turned to her. I let the silence stretch, let her sit in it, let her feel the weight of what had just happened. She shifted in her seat, reached for her glass of water, took a small sip, anything to avoid looking at me directly. But she knew she had just lost control of the narrative. And then, when she finally worked up the nerve to meet my eyes, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I placed it on the table between us, tapped the screen, and pressed play. Her voice filled the air. "He's clueless. He believes everything I tell him." Her breath caught. She stared at the phone as if it had just appeared out of nowhere, as if it was some kind of magic trick revealing her worst secret in front of her own eyes. And then, the next part of the recording played. "Once I get things sorted, we'll have everything. The money, the house, the cars. It's all in my name anyway. He won't even see it coming." I watched as every ounce of color drained from her face. She reached for the phone, maybe to shut it off, maybe to throw it, maybe just to make it all stop, but I was faster. I pulled it back, tucked it into my pocket, leaned back in my chair, and stared at her. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Her mind was racing, searching for an excuse, an explanation, anything that could fix what had just happened, but there was nothing. For the first time since this all started, she had nothing. That I stood up slowly, smoothing my hands over my jacket, staring down at her with the kind of calm that I knew scared her more than if I had yelled, if I had thrown something, if I had made a scene. "Enjoy your dinner," I said. And then I walked away. She didn't follow me. She didn't call after me. She just sat there, stunned, her perfect little world crumbling around her. She had spent so long crafting this, so long believing she was in control, but now, the truth was out. She wasn't going to get my house. She wasn't going to get my money. She wasn't going to take everything I had worked for. Because I had proof now. I had everything I needed. The next morning, I went straight to my lawyer, and she had no idea just how bad things were about to get for her. I didn't go home that night. I didn't want to be anywhere near her, didn't want to hear whatever pathetic excuses she was going to come up with, didn't want to see her try to twist the truth in a way that made her look like the victim. I knew she would. I had seen her do it before in small ways, in arguments where she found a way to make me feel like the unreasonable one, where she would twist my words and turn my own concerns against me until I was the one apologizing. But this time, there was nothing she could say. Nothing she could do. She had been caught. The evidence was undeniable. And by now, she knew that I wasn't just going to sit back and let her get away with it. I booked a hotel for the night, turned off my phone, and let myself feel the full weight of everything that had happened. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt. It wasn't just the fact that she had been lying to me for months, maybe even years. It was the fact that she had looked me in the eyes, smiled at me, kissed me, told me she loved me, all while planning to take everything from me. She hadn't just been sneaking around. She had been waiting, calculating, preparing for the moment when she could blindside me, take my house, my money, my cars, and walk away like none of it ever mattered. Like I never mattered, and I knew that if I had never caught her, she would have gone through with it. That was the part that hit the hardest. That I barely slept that night. I kept replaying everything in my head, going over every moment where I had ignored my instincts, every time I had brushed off something that didn't feel right, every time she had smiled at me while secretly laughing behind my back. It made me sick. But it also fueled me, because if she thought she was going to win, she was wrong. That I met with my lawyer first thing in the morning. I had already started putting things in motion before I even confronted her, but now I had the final piece of the puzzle: the recording. It was more than enough proof that she was planning to commit fraud, that she had been manipulating the situation to set herself up for a payday that she didn't deserve. I laid everything out, every bank transaction, every inconsistency, every little thing I had uncovered in the past few weeks. My lawyer listened carefully, nodding as I explained everything, and when I was done, he leaned back in his chair and let out a low whistle. "She really thought she was going to pull this off," he said, shaking his head. "She almost did," I admitted. "But she got greedy. And that was her downfall." By the time I left the office, the divorce papers were already being prepared. But it wasn't just a divorce. I was making sure she got nothing. No house, no cars, no money. I had worked too hard to build my life, and I wasn't about to let someone who never truly cared about me walk away with half of everything I had earned. Not only that, but I had enough evidence to prove that she had been actively scheming against me, which meant she wasn't just losing the divorce, she was about to lose her reputation, her security, and the future she had so carefully planned for herself. And she still had no idea it was coming. When I finally went home, she was waiting. I could see it in her face, the panic, the uncertainty. She had spent the entire night spiraling, trying to figure out her next move. She had probably assumed I was going to explode, to scream, to throw things, to make a scene at the restaurant. But I hadn't. And that scared her more than anything. She didn't know what I was thinking. She didn't know what I was planning. And for the first time, she was the one caught off guard. She stood up as soon as I walked in, her voice carefully controlled. "Where were you?" I ignored her, walked past her, went straight to the bedroom, and started packing a bag. That's when she knew. She rushed after me, her voice rising just slightly. "You're overreacting. You don't understand what you heard." I zipped the suitcase without looking at her. "I understand perfectly. I was just venting," she said quickly, shifting tactics. "I was frustrated, I was saying things I didn't mean. You're twisting this into something it's not." I turned to her slowly, finally meeting her eyes. You said you were going to take everything from me. My voice was calm, too calm. You said I wouldn't even see it coming. She faltered for just a second, just long enough for me to see the guilt flash across her face. Then, she recovered, straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin. You don't have proof. I let the silence stretch, then pulled out my phone and pressed play. Her own voice filled the air, clear as day, saying those exact words. She went pale that I watched as every ounce of confidence drained from her, as she realized there was no way out of this, no way to spin the story, no way to manipulate her way back into control. She tried to reach for the phone, but I pulled it away before she could, and then, finally, she cracked. Fine, she snapped, her voice shaking now, her anger bubbling to the surface. Yes. I was planning to leave you. I was planning to take everything. Because you don't deserve any of it. I didn't respond. I just picked up my suitcase and walked past her. You think you're going to win? She called after me, her voice shrill now, desperate. You think you're the victim? I paused at the doorway, turned back to face her one last time. I don't need to think, I said simply. I know. And then I left. She had no idea that within the next few days, her life was going to fall apart completely. That her lover, who had only been with her because he thought she was about to come into a lot of money, was going to leave her the second he realized she had nothing. That she was going to end up with nowhere to go, no support, forced to crawl back to the same people she had once looked down on. She had played the long game, but in the end, I was the one who won. That I left that house knowing I was never coming back. There was nothing left for me there, nothing worth fighting for, nothing worth saving. My wife, the woman I had trusted, the woman I had spent years building a life with, had destroyed everything the moment she decided I was nothing more than an obstacle between her and the future she thought she deserved. But the thing about people like her, people who think they can manipulate their way into wealth, into security, into a life they didn't earn, is that they always overestimate themselves. She thought she had it all figured out. She thought she was in control. She thought she was untouchable. And now, she was about to realize just how wrong she was. I checked into a hotel that night, but I didn't sleep. I spent hours going over every detail of the plan, making sure there were no loose ends, no room for her to twist things around. She was good at lying, good at playing the victim, good at turning situations in her favor. But this time, there was nothing she could do. The court documents had already been filed. The bank accounts had been secured. The evidence had been handed over to my lawyer. And now, all I had to do was wait for the hammer to drop. She called me the next morning, her number lighting up my screen like a warning signal. I didn't answer. She sent messages, first pretending to be concerned, then demanding to know where I was, then accusing me of overreacting. I ignored all of them. By the afternoon, the calls had stopped. I knew she was scrambling, trying to figure out what to do next, trying to salvage whatever she could before it was too late. But she had no idea that it was already over. The first blow came when she tried to access our joint accounts and found them empty. I had moved everything into accounts she couldn't touch, accounts that were mine alone. The second blow came when she received the court papers, the divorce petition that made it clear she was walking away with nothing. And the third, the final, crushing blow came when she realized her lover wasn't going to be there to catch her when she fell. That I had been waiting for that moment. That I had known from the beginning that he was using her just as much as she had been planning to use me. He wasn't some great love, some romantic escape from her marriage. He was a parasite, someone who thought he was getting an easy ride, someone who thought he was about to be handed a fortune. But when he saw the reality, when he realized she wasn't about to come into money, that she wasn't taking my house, my cars, my assets, he did exactly what I knew he would do. He left her. I got the confirmation from a mutual acquaintance, a message letting me know that she had shown up at his place, expecting to be welcomed in, expecting to start her new life with him, only to be met with a locked door. He didn't even have the decency to face her himself. He had packed up and left before she even arrived, cutting off all contact, erasing himself from her life the same way she had planned to erase me. And just like that, she had nothing. She tried to call me again. I let it go to voicemail. She tried to reach out through mutual friends, spinning her story, trying to find some kind of sympathy, but no one wanted to be involved. The people who had once admired her, who had envied our relationship, who had seen her as this confident, successful woman, now saw her for what she really was. A fraud. A liar. Someone who had tried to play the game and lost. She had no choice but to move in with her relatives, people she had once looked down on, people she had distanced herself from because they didn't fit the image she wanted to project. But now, they were the only ones who would take her. She went from planning a future filled with wealth and luxury to sharing a cramped apartment with 4 other people, sleeping on a couch, relying on the very people she had spent years pretending she was better than, and I moved on. I didn't waste my time being bitter. I didn't dwell on what could have been. She had already taken enough from me, and I wasn't going to let her take another second of my life. I finalized the divorce, secured my assets, and walked away with everything she thought she was going to steal from me. I built something better, something stronger, and I never looked back. The last time I heard about her was months later. A friend mentioned seeing her at a local cafe, looking tired, worn down, nothing like the woman she had once been. She wasn't thriving. She wasn't moving on to something better. She was stuck, trapped in the consequences of her own choices, forced to live with the reality she had created for herself. She had played her game, and she had lost. Weeks passed, and I never once spoke to her again. The silence was deliberate, something I knew she hated more than anything. She had always been in control, always the one steering the conversation, making the rules, deciding how things played out. But now, she had no power, no influence, no ability to manipulate the situation in her favor. She was alone with the weight of her own choices, and there was nothing she could do to escape them. The divorce moved quickly. There was nothing for her to fight for, no assets she could claim, no arguments she could make. The proof was stacked against her. The recordings, the financial statements, the conversations I had documented, it was all airtight. Her lawyer barely put up a fight. There was no way to spin it, no way to make it look like anything other than what it was. A calculated betrayal. A failed scheme. A complete loss. When the papers were finalized, I felt nothing. No relief, no satisfaction, no triumph. Just a quiet, steady understanding that I had made it through something designed to destroy me, and I had come out the other side stronger. She had wanted to break me. Instead, she had only exposed herself for who she truly was. I heard about her from time to time. People talked, and while I never asked, the updates always found their way to me. She had tried to rebuild, but nothing worked out the way she planned. Her job let her go shortly after the truth about her affair came out. Whether it was because of the scandal or just bad timing, I didn't know, and I didn't care. The man she had been so desperate to start a new life with had cut her off completely, refusing to take her calls, blocking her from his life. She had gambled everything and lost, and now, she was left with nothing but regret. The last I heard, she was still living with her relatives, the same ones she had once looked down on, sharing a tiny apartment, struggling to piece her life back together. It wasn't the grand, wealthy future she had envisioned for herself. It wasn't the luxury and comfort she thought she was going to steal from me. It was the reality she had earned, and me. I moved forward. I didn't carry bitterness. I didn't waste time dwelling on what had happened. I had learned my lesson, had seen firsthand what happens when you trust the wrong person, when you ignore the warning signs, when you believe in someone who never deserved it. And I made a promise to myself that I would never let it happen again. She had thought she was playing the perfect game, but in the end, she had only played herself.